Thank you, Lucas, for opening the space with that lovely performance. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Takahashi, and I'm a member of New York Day of Remembrance. For anyone wondering what those songs were, the first was Lucas's instrumental improvisation of the traditional sakura melody, and the second was his cover of 1960s classic Japanese crooner tune, Ue o Muite Aruko by Rokusuke A. If you want to hear more of Lucas's music, you can find him at lucasmayahara.rotman.com. Now I'm going to pass it back to my co-MC Lucas to lead our land acknowledgement.
Hello, how are you? Oh, I love your background, Alexis. That is so awesome. As we always begin our programs, we always begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that we stand on sacred grounds, and our many thanks to the American Indian Community House, who've created this land acknowledgement to use in New York City. So the land of the five boroughs that make up New York City are the traditional homelands of the Lenape, Merrick, Canarsie, Rockaway, and Matinecock nations. And these lands are the intertribal trade lands that are under the stewardship of many more indigenous nations. New York City is home to the largest population of intertribal Native American First Nations and indigenous individuals of any urban city across Turtle Island, this North America. Some were born here with deep roots in the city and in the New York City area, extending back for generations and generations. Others come to New York City to find what they couldn't find in other places, and each group has contributed to the rich and diverse culture that is the New York City urban Indian community. So this is their story. And we acknowledge at the same time the systematic erasure of many nations and recognize those still among us today. So we acknowledge the people of these nations, their cultures, communities, and elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And we also acknowledge, offer deep gratitude to the island of Manhattan, the land and waters upon which we now stand. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it right back over to Alexis to give you an overview of today's program.
Great, thank you. 80 years ago today, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which called for the forcible removal and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. The first Day of Remembrance event was organized in Seattle in 1978 as a way to galvanize the community around the redress movement. Every year since, Japanese Americans have gathered each year to mourn those who've passed, fight against social injustice, and make sure our histories are never forgotten. In this same spirit of resistance, New York Day of Remembrance is excited to bring together a program today that grounds us in our community's historic fight for reparations and explores how we can connect this legacy of activism to the present day fight for reparations for Black Americans. In addition to an amazing slate of speakers and our traditional candle lighting ceremony, we also will be sharing some never before seen footage and songs that we're really excited to share with you all. At around 2:30, after our program completes, we'll also have time to gather in small groups and connect with one another. To get us started, I'd like to pass the mic over to my fellow member of New York Day of Remembrance, Stan Honda, who's going to kick us off with an overview of the history of Japanese American redress.
Thanks, Alexis. Among the many protections the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution gives us is the right, and I quote, to petition the government for redress of grievances, end quote. The ability for citizens to petition our government for redress of grievances is the key to understanding how the Japanese American community united and turned the unconstitutional and shameful act of incarceration into an apology and reparations. In the late 1960s, Japanese Americans began to revisit the history of the exclusion and incarceration period in order to seek justice for their suffering and ensure that no wrong would ever be committed again. In the 1970s, 3 Japanese American organizations pursued redress in court and in Congress. Years of effort by community activists, politicians, academics, and other supporters culminated on August 10th, 1988, with the signing of the Civil Liberties Act by President Ronald Reagan. This act rescinded Executive Order 9066 and mandated an official apology from the federal government, monetary reparations payments to individuals excluded and incarcerated, and the creation of a federal fund for research and education about the incarceration. The redress movement refers to these efforts. Congress and President Jimmy Carter approved the creation of a commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians, otherwise known as CWRIC, in 1980. This bipartisan commission held 20 days of hearings with more than 750 witnesses and spent a year and a half researching scholarship and archival sources. Ironically, while the Japanese American Citizens League advocacy of a commission proposal was criticized as a ploy to avoid monetary redress, the actual 1981 hearings expanded and strengthened community support for redress. More than 500 former detainees testified, and many had never shared their experiences with public or even their own children. Their accounts of pain and suffering galvanized redress support from Japanese Americans who attended the hearings or read excerpts of testimony in newspapers and magazines. The Commission's 1983 report acknowledged the injustice of mass exclusion, removal, and detention, and concluded that these policies were caused not by, quote, military necessity, but by, quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So my fellow committee member, Kimiba, will continue with the history of the redress movement.
Four months later, the Commission recommended Congress and the President issue a national apology, establish a foundation to educate the public, and provide $20,000 to each surviving detainee. Limiting redress eligibility to living victims helped alleviate concern redress could set a precedent for the descendants of slaves, American Indians forced onto reservations, Mexicans who lost land, and other historical victims of racism. The surviving detainees were sent a written apology signed by President George H.W. Bush and a check for $20,000. Most Japanese Latin American internees, however, had to fight to receive any redress compensation because they were initially excluded from the provisions of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which limited redress to US citizens and permanent residents. A coalition of groups negotiated a 1998 settlement, which eventually provided inadequate. Currently, activists continue lobbying the US government to provide Japanese Latin Americans with redress equity and the same $20,000 compensation amount given to Japanese Americans. When Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, he proclaimed the government affirmed that day, our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. Some Japanese American activists might agree and characterize the redress movement as a shining example of the greatness of American democracy. Other activists, however, believe that the real lesson of redress is the need for continued vigilance to make sure civil liberties are never again sacrificed because of war hysteria or racism. After 9/11, these activists participated in demonstrations denouncing hate crimes, racial profiling, and unconstitutional detentions. Remembering few Americans protested the decision to remove and incarcerate Japanese Americans in 1942, these individuals and groups wanted to prevent history from repeating itself and victimizing Arab, Muslims, and South Asian Americans because of wartime racism. Currently, Our Suda for Solidarity group is protesting and calling for the closure of detention centers for undocumented children across the country and supporting frontline immigrant and refugee communities that are being targeted by racist, inhumane immigration policies. The national redress movement early on was West Coast centered, and initial plans for hearings included Washington, D.C. and West Coast cities, but left out New York City. The Japanese American community in New York was rightfully upset and organized to demand a hearing in New York. Leslee Inaba Wong was a part of this effort and will now give us her account of that time.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So to begin, as Kenniss stated, the Commission on Wartime, Relocation and Internment of Civilians, or CWIRC, held its first public hearing on July 16, 1981 in Washington, D.C., and New York was not included on its list of future community sites. A group of activists who belong to concerned Japanese Americans had been waging a 2-month campaign to include New York. We circulated petitions and collected hundreds of signatures. We outreached to other organizations and began meeting with prospective testifiers. And all of this was presented to the CWIRC at that first hearing by Sasha Hori. The commissioners listened and consented, and we were on. We had 2.5 months to organize for the hearing, and in that time, we formed the East Coast Japanese Americans for Redress, or ECJAR, which was an ad hoc committee that included all of the major Japanese American organizations and churches. We outreached to Japanese Americans in the tri-state area and had a tremendous response. Each mass meeting held in the basement of the JA United Church on 7th Avenue multiplied in numbers until upwards to 400 people attended our last meeting. And people did amazing things, like creating the 9066 barbed wire logo that was used on buttons and t-shirts and sold for fundraising. Folks solicited support statements from local and national politicians. And Bill Kochiyama, who's featured in the video you'll shortly view, wrote and hand-delivered all of the press releases. The New York hearing was truly our hearing, but the commission saw it differently. And as the day for the hearing approached, they fairly heavy-handedly imposed their agenda on us. A flashpoint came at our last community meeting before the hearing. We had submitted a list of testifiers who we believed represented the wartime and resettlement experiences of New York JAs. The commission sent us its own list, and some of our testifiers had been eliminated. Sasha appealed, but they told us that their decision was final. The back and forth correspondence on this issue became a bit confrontational, and then the commission issued their warning. If we did not comply, they would cancel the hearings altogether. This was reported to everyone at our meeting, and the reactions were strong. We were angry and felt disrespected and betrayed. Our community testifiers who had come forward after all these years and were willing to share their stories had been iced. There was a great deal of grumbling, but we did work so hard that no one wanted to risk having the hearing canceled. So there was also a lot of very positive collective discussion. We noted that many of our testifiers who were on our list were also on the commissions. and all of the testimonies submitted would become part of national record. So we decided to dedicate our next DOR program to the testifiers who had been asked by the Commission, allowing them to publicly share their experiences. In addition, anyone else who wanted to read their testimonies was welcome to do so. Consensus was reached. The hearing could go forward, and all of our voices would still be heard. And with that, there settled over us a sense of unity and strong community. And then Yuri Kochiyama got up and said, "We should close this meeting with a song." And this small woman, who was 95 pounds of pure nuclear energy, walked up to the front of the room and distributed sheets of paper containing the lyrics to a song for redress reparation, which she had written. And then Mrs. Akamatsu, who was the wife of the minister of the JA Church during the turbulent years of resettlement, and who looked like everybody's bachan, marched up to the piano and began to play. And we all stood up together and proudly belted out the redress song. On the day of the hearing, we walked into a meeting room at the Roosevelt Hotel where it was being held. At one of our previous meetings, we'd agreed that we would hang on the wall these huge paintings that had been done by Byron Goto, an artist from Hawaii. Each of the panels illustrated his visceral and emotional response to Executive Order 9066. But that morning, the panels were nowhere to be seen. We learned that at the 11th hour, the Commission had prohibited us from hanging the panels because they were too, quote, controversial. The hearing was called to order, and Bill Kochiyama was to give the last testimony before the lunch break. Bill was a native New Yorker and a 442 vet. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy who was totally dedicated to R&R. It had been a long morning, and by the time it was his turn, people were tired and a bit listless. Then Bill, squarely facing the commissioners, began to speak. And all of a sudden, Byron's paintings came marching up the main aisle to the front of the meeting room. They were being carried by Nisei and Sansei, and each panel was held high, hiding their heads and upper bodies, so the images just seemed to float forward to the table where the commissioners were seated. Then everyone woke up. Photographers jumped into action. Cameras started whirling and clicking. And Bill's testimony, which was powerful in and of itself, was accompanied by the, quote, ban posters. They had planned it. Bill and the other Niseis, who were tired of being pushed around, had staged the whole thing. And the irony is that event became one of the highlights of the New York hearing, and Corky Lee's iconic photo of Byron Goto's posters, framing Bill as he testified, was published in the New York Times, picked up by the Associated Press, and run nationally. And the image continues to be used today. Which brings us to the present. Stan Nakazono from our committee found out over 15 years ago there was a video of the New York hearing and the powerful testimonies. He embarked on a decade-and-a-half search for the tapes and finally discovered them. And Stan Honda will read Stan's account of this remarkable search, and then we'll view some of the testimonies. Stan?
Thank you, Leslie. Here are some of Stan's recollections of his search for the videotapes that he emailed me. I was working on the Japanese American Association's 100th anniversary video back in 2006, researching Japanese and Japanese American history in New York City. I found out that Keiko Tsuno of Downtown Community Television Center, DCTV, had shot the entire New York City Commission hearings at the Roosevelt Hotel on November 23rd, 1981. When I asked her for the original tapes, Tsuno said she had donated them to an organization in San Francisco, now known as Center for Asian American Media, or CAAM, CAM, hoping the tapes would be viewed and shared to all, even though I did a search of the DCTV building in Chinatown just to make sure. However, when I finally contacted CAM in 2016 and visited San Francisco to search for those tapes in their basement, they were nowhere to be found. CAM mentioned that they had a deeper storage space in another part of the city, but I didn't have time to search there. In July 2021, I just finished working on the restoration of New York's Day of Remembrance slideshow video from 1986. This video was shared online by Leslee Inaba Wong and others, where they reached out to various Asian American organizations, including the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. It was there that Johnny Sake, head of the media department, and whom I've worked with at Visual Communications, VC, in Los Angeles in a previous life, told me JANM had those New York City tapes since the 1990s. It had been sitting at the museum collecting dust. After another of our VC colleagues who used to work at CAM sent the JANM Museum those tapes back in the 1980s, JANM was supposed to return them to CAM, which obviously never happened. So the JANM Museum ended up digitizing 8 videotapes, which is only half of which was originally shot. We obtained the digitized files of those tapes by October 2021, just in time for the 40th anniversary of the New York City Commission hearings in November. The search for the rest of the tapes still continues, presumably at that CAM deep storage in San Francisco. So here's a brief excerpt of those videotapes with incredibly powerful testimony, starting with testimony by Bill Kochiyama.
For the first time in my life, I felt like a second-class citizen. Everywhere I was advised to find work with my own people. A dismal prospect because I did not know a single word of Japanese, nor anything about my cultural heritage. Desperate, I located a Japanese employment agency which directed me to a large dry cleaning and laundry establishment in Oakland. About a week after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the firm was forced to suspend operation. Subsequently, I tried to enlist in the armed forces, first with the Army, then the Navy, and finally the Marines. At each recruiting station, I was thrown out on my ear. No Japs were wanted.
She, her 2 sisters, my parents, my 3 sisters, and a brother were all incarcerated in Tanforan and Topaz. My other brother and I were already serving in the U.S. Army at the time, but when the 442nd Infantry Regiment was activated, we were both assigned to it, and my third brother volunteered later from Topaz. As First Sergeant in Love Company, I actively participated in combat in both Italy and France, including the rescue of the, quote, lost battalion, unquote, in the Vosges Mountains.
それで私一人で1944の6月にニューヨークへ参りました。私のハズバンドの清水はディテンションキャンプに行きましたから、前科者ですね。前科者ですから、だからクリアリングの紙がなければ来られないので少し遅くなりました。清水はローズブルグニューメキシコのイントゥーメントキャンプで14ヶ月ばかり家族と離れて、息子と私は の入ったキャンプはヒラ、アリゾナのキャンプでした。
Living quarters were overcrowded. Hundreds of bunks of Army, Navy type were squeezed into an immensely large hall where 120 and 150 to 200 people were confined.
I note that you apparently were jailed for about 3.5 months. December till
Yeah.
March. Were German and Italian aliens held on Ellis Island at the same time you were there?
We heard that, and they are making a lot of noise. But we are so quiet.
Were you held in separate areas? Were you?
Yes, yes.
The hardships which my family and I experienced were not only financial ones, but were traumatically physical and emotional ones as well. 1 week before the Topaz camp was to be closed, my wife had to undergo a hysterectomy in the camp hospital. She was then forced to leave camp in a very weakened condition and traveled to New York with her 2 young sons. She was never physically or psychologically as healthy as before her camp experience. Then, too, she suffered from high blood pressure, and the high altitude in that part of Utah was detrimental to her health. I believe the emotional strain of the evacuation and her hasty operation contributed to her death only 4 short years after she came to New York.
Within a month of being freed from the relocation camp in Gila River, Arizona, my mother, who had to do hard manual labor in a cannery, broke down and was committed to a mental hospital in Trenton, New Jersey. There was not one person in the institution who could speak Japanese or work with her. When the doctor at the hospital said my mother needed an operation, and I was called a prefrontal lobotomy, I thought it would help make her well. Now I know that that operation is irreversible. I must live with this trauma and regret.
On the last day, the ferry carried an exclusive group of passengers, now guarded by armed soldiers. At the Seattle ferry terminal, we met a sea of hostile faces. How did they know of our enforced exodus when we ourselves had no precedents to follow and no prior knowledge of what lay ahead? Near the waterfront, we were boarded onto trains while news photographers and reporters converged upon us. As the train pulled out, I felt myself slipping into a void so profound, I can hardly speak of it now. Where were we going? Why? The immediate period which followed is lost because I fell into a psychotic state, induced by the weeks of dread and apprehension, climaxing at Manzanar. My breakdown was a well-kept family secret, a source of shame, a subject never discussed.
In the meantime, the families obtained the service of the American Civil Liberty Union, and the man of the hour was Mr. Wern, attorney who represented us at the trial. Others have left us high and dry, mainly the Japanese American Citizen League. We were expecting this group to give us their full support, but instead turned their back on us. To this day, I still feel a knife in the back. A day or so before the trial, the Japanese American Citizen League surprised us with a visit from the VIP. Their main purpose was to get us to change our mind by resisting the draft. Some of the comments made to us were, we were doing injustice to the men in uniform. In time of war, we have to do our part to supporting the government. If you go to prison, you'll get beat up with 2x4s. Just ignorant scare tactics.
It would be somewhat similar, akin to what Yasui and Karabayashi did. They, in fact, violated the law as well.
I mean, I'm very familiar with Gordon because we were at the same joint. And, well, this is all con language. You know, I've been there 2 years. But anyway, I met Gordon up there. And his was through the evacuate, the civil rights were violated. But we were, in the same sense, but we wanted a guarantee of our rights before we preserve democracy, like we learned in school.
When we arrived at Talara, there was a ship waiting for us. I learned only recently that the name of the ship was the Frederick C. Johnson, an American ship. As we boarded, our pencils, pens, knives, and razor blades were taken from us by United States officers. We were put into the bottom of the ship, where we were given 2 meals a day during the trip to San Francisco, which lasted approximately 3 weeks. After a few days in San Francisco, we were placed on a train and taken to Kennedy internment camp in Texas. The complete separation from the peaceful family and social life I had in Peru without committing a wrong, and without even a hearing, our individual rights had been taken away from us.
Wow, that was just so powerful. Thank you so much for that. That video just brought chills, and I'm, brought, like many of you, I'm brought back to my own family history of having a grandfather who fought and died in the 442nd, while at the same time, his father was interned in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that testimony just really shook me up emotionally. But thank you so much, and Leslie, thank you so much for sharing that part of a history that I knew very little about. But that's why we're here. One of the many reasons. And today, as we acknowledge and celebrate our own journey towards redress and reparations, we're really honored today to have a very special guest. Kenniss Henry is co-chair of NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Black Reparations in America, speaking with us today. And this is a great opportunity for us to learn about the history and struggle for reparations for African Americans, and about the advancement of the bill HR 40, and how importantly we in the Japanese American community can lend our voices and support to this critically important and long overdue conversation. Just a little bit about Kenniss Henry. She will tell you more, anything that I've left out. She's a lifelong activist and advocate for underprivileged and marginalized people of African descent. She's been passionate in her support, advancement, and implementation of Afrocentric curriculum and education in schools. And while not a member of the organization, Kenniss was a strong supporter for the rights of MOVE activists in Philadelphia, my hometown, may I add. And her reparations work began over 10 years ago in DC with the Reparations Study Group, then the activist organization Black Reparations Now, and from there to the Empowerment Research Group. Now, Kenniss joined NCOBRA in early 2017 and became the National Legislative Commission co-chair, and has been central in orchestrating and organizing the coalition's ongoing legislative efforts. So a big thank you to Kenniss for joining us and for all of your inspiring work.
So thank you, Lucas, for that profound introduction. I want to thank you all for allowing me to be here. I have goosebumps. Your stories bring tears to my eyes, but it also sends a message that must resonate with all of us. We are in this together. This isn't your fight. It isn't someone else's fight. It is our fight. We're in this together. The only other thing I would like to add to my background history is straight out of college, I was selected to be a member of a very small elite team of recent college graduates who were sent to the state of New Jersey because New Jersey had decided that it was never going to desegregate. Imagine being 21 years old, walking into a space of 155,000 square feet, and I'm the only face in there. And my job was to be there and not to back down, and to send a message that the state of New Jersey had to desegregate. All I can say is I was young, dumb, and stupid because I did it and I stayed there for 8 years. So you've asked me to come and you've asked me to talk about the reparations struggle of people of African descent and to speak a little bit on HR 40. Such an amazing title, such an amazing assignment. First of all, reparations is nothing new. Reparations have been awarded to groups for a very long time. And as a matter of fact, at the end of the enslavement period, the enslavers got reparations. For every one of their enslaved persons, they actually were paid. They got reparations. So it's not a new topic. But every time we talk about reparations, what we hear is that was then and this is now, get over it. What we hear is there's no one from back in that time period who can come and tell the stories. But we also know that our scholars, the Ta-Nehisi Coates as an example, they've done the research and they have the information, they have the proof of what we say is our history, 400 plus years of pernicious history, and it continues. It's not as if it ended, it still continues. So the vestiges are still there current day. Why is it that we cannot get reparations? Well, the biggest thing we hear is there is no money. We don't have any money. We can't give you reparations. There is no money. So let's look at how it could have been paid for. Just as an example, we just came out of a 20-year war and the figures are out. Now, I have to say there's a little bit to be said about fake news, but the figures are out. 20 years and we lost that war and it cost us $10 trillion. $10 trillion. Imagine over 20 years, even if we got $0.5 trillion a year for 20 years, we would have had reparatory justice to the tune of $10 trillion. But yet and still, we can't continue to hear there is no money. Yet and still, we're willing to pay $10 trillion for a war that we lost. This country is unwilling to approach the topic of reparations for people of African descent. HR 40 has been in Congress for the past 3 decades. 3 decades. And it, for years, had no co-sponsors. 8 years, we were told, do not talk about HR 40. Do not embarrass anyone. So for 8 years, there was no discussion about HR 40. And today, for the first time ever, we can say we have 217 confirmed supporters and co-sponsors in Congress. We should be happy, but guess what? The chances of HR 40 going to the floor for debates and a vote, not even. What we're hearing is, right now, what we're hearing is, oh, don't talk about it because we're trying to give you the first Black female Supreme Court justice candidate and confirmation. So you don't want to talk about anything but the fact that we're trying to do this for you. Most recently, we heard that our elected officials do not want to bring HR 40 to the floor at all. 3 decades plus, and we're still talking about 400 plus years of Benicia's history. And they do not want to bring it to the floor. So how do we deal with that? I mean, what do we do? Because this country maintains it is not a racist country. It's just full of racist practices. But how can you have racist practices without being a racist country? Those racist practices have morphed into institutionalized, systemic, and structural racism. The triplets that were birthed out of the enslavement period of our lives. 256 years of forced-free labor in and of itself, 256 years. And we didn't get a penny, not one dime. And when we were emancipated, they let us go off of the plantations, not even with a biscuit or a piece of fat back to take with us. They sent us on our way. But they had a plan, and the plan was they'll be back. They don't have anything to eat. They have no place to go. They will come back. And if they don't come back, we'll just come up with ways to deal with them. Convict leasing. Let me tell you a little bit about convict leasing. The state of Alabama, for 53 years, they paid their operating budget. 85% of their operating budget came from the convict leasing of our ancestors. 85% of their operating budget came from the convict leasing of our ancestors. What did they do wrong? They stared at someone. They brushed up against someone. That got them a whole year in prison, working on the chain gang. And yet and still, when we say it's time for us to get reparations, they said, no. You're trying to steal money from those of us who earned our money to give it to those people who have no moral claims. I submit to you, racism is universal in this country. It is widespread, deep-seated. It is such that it is invisible. And because of that, it has become the norm. The Honorable Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm of the great state of New York said that in 1970. And it's true. It is so pervasive, it's invisible. It's just a way of life. So how do we change that narrative? Maybe instead of when folks say to you, why reparations? Perhaps you can say back, and I know this is the cardinal sin of English teachers around the world. You never answer a question with a question. However, when they say, why reparations? Perhaps you should say back, why not reparations? Turn it around, put it back on them. When they say, why reparations? Say, why not reparations? Another thing that has to happen, and it's not with any particular group, for my people of African descent, this history is embarrassing. They don't want to talk about it because it hurts. It's painful. But what if we said, every time we have a conversation, we weave reparations into that conversation? I know this sounds crazy, but let's look at it for a minute. You're in a restaurant, you're getting ready to order Cobb salad or hamburger, whatever. So what if you said, I want a reparations Cobb salad? And guess what? The server's going to be like, excuse me, what did you say? I want a reparations Cobb salad. So the server's looking at the menu. He doesn't see reparations Cobb salad there, but he uses the word reparations because he's saying, I'm sorry, I don't see reparations Cobb salad. So you said, oh, the salad right here. Oh, you want a Cobb salad? Yes, I want a Cobb salad. But I thought you said you wanted the reparations Cobb salad. Yeah, maybe I did. Guess what he's going to do, or she? They're going to go in the back, and that's going to be a story that they retell to the staff in the back. This crazy woman out here at my table 7, she just asked for a reparations Cobb salad. So now everyone is talking about reparations. Well, what is a reparations Cobb salad? I don't know what a reparations Cobb salad is, but she asked for a reparations Cobb salad. So we collectively have to find ways. If we say never again, and we never want to forget, we have to make sure that we keep it in the forefront of everyone. Not just that, we have to do a better job of speaking about the truth of our collective histories. And I owe you all an apology, because it's only been in the past 2 years that I learned about the treatment that this country rendered to the Japanese Peruvian members of society, and how they turned them into pawns. But in exchange for that, we also have to talk about our history. How did we get here? For example, everyone holds Thomas Jefferson in the highest of esteem. He crafted one of the greatest documents ever, but no one wants to tell the truth. He had sex with a 13-year-old piece of property, 13 years old. But it's always portrayed as one of the greatest love stories ever. How can it be the greatest love story ever? You're 30-some years old having sex with a 13-year-old person who has, by the Supreme Court's decision, no rights that a white man is obligated to abide by. So we have to tell those stories. When they say, why reparations? We have to put the stories out there. We have to be the ones. Coming to a close here. Why is it that we don't tell the true stories? For example, our enslavers bought our ancestors and they set them up in brothels to make money. Our enslavers bought our enslaved ancestors and they used them for medical experimentation without any anesthesia, because they said we have a high propensity for pain. We don't need anesthesia. We don't need that. As an example, our ancestors developed a habit of walking in the street with a big old hat on and looking down at the ground. Why do you think they did that? That was hoping that they would get back home to their families, because at any minute, some woman might say, he looked at me, he stared at me. And do you know what's going to happen to that person? Whether he did or he didn't. Mass mobs are going to snap somebody off of the street and they're going to lynch them. That's a part of our history. Over 5,000 documented cases of lynchings. However, there are several cases where someone came out their door, walked down the street, and there was a charred body dangling from a tree. Nobody talked about that, because to say something about it may have cost you your life, but you knew that was Uncle Bud swinging from the tree, because you never saw Uncle Bud again. You never heard from him. We have to do a better job of telling all of our stories. And why do you think CRT is something no one wants to have no one wants to have any of those topics taught in school? Everyone is saying CRT is the way to go, but it's not. It is a way to make our oppressors feel good about themselves. It has nothing to do with us. And we have to do a better job of collectively learning our collective history so that we have a say in the curricula that's offered in our schools. Because we know the lies that are in the history books, not just Christopher Columbus, Bessie Ross, that was a lie. But they refused to take it out of the history books because so many little girls view Bessie Ross as one of their heroes, sheroes. But if we know our collective history, we can push back against that. Recently, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus in leadership happened to have been in a situation with one of her male peers from the great state of Kentucky, a slave state. He put his hands on her. He touched her, and he proceeded to go off with a litany of profanity at her. But just think, 100 years ago, that same situation, had it been a Black man who put his hands on a white woman, and we can think of Emmett Till, we can think of so many others, they would have been lynched. So we have to turn those situations around. When something like that happens, we have to be collectively enraged about it, and we have to say something. No, you don't put your hands on her. Not because we want to be confrontational or fight somebody, but we remember the history of when it was a carnal sin for a Black man to even be on the street with a white woman. And it's not just that. It's so much more of our history that we must commit to learning our collective histories. We must always speak of the atrocities that this country continues to perpetrate on us, the victims, because it is a hierarchical society. And this country needs it to always be a hierarchical society because they need someone that they can always view as a doormat and that they can step on and continue to grind into the ground. We must always push back when we hear negative rhetoric. I did an interview and the person said, "Why are you trying to take my savings away from me? Why do you not want me to own a house?" Well, there's something called intergenerational poverty. And it began the first day one of our ancestors stepped off the first slave ship and became someone who was enslaved. We still can't get this country to say this country was built on the backs of our ancestors. We can't get this country to admit that our ancestral blood is forever mixed into the soil of this country. There's no way around it. Here's an amazing piece of information. No one thought about it. At the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, there is a graveyard. Think about it for just a minute. At the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is a graveyard. You said graveyard? Are there any headstones down there? No. But it is estimated that there are 2 million strong at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. How did that come about? Well, every time a slave ship came over, anybody who died, they tossed them overboard, fed the shark. The shark had a great time. But not just those who were dead, from time to time, they tossed live bodies over too, to send a message to the African captives, this can happen to you also. Or they decided, hey, everyone on the ship is insured. So what if I throw a few of them overboard? I'm still going to be reimbursed for the loss. And we have to talk about those atrocities. We have to recognize that even though slavery is gone, the enslavement of our ancestors, it has left a profound impact on this country. It has. There is no other situation that has been as profound. Slavery is pervasive. It has taken a profound impact on the economics of this country, on the social realities of this country, and on the political realities of this country. Because otherwise, why would we still have HR 40? It is a harmless piece of legislation. It is. All it's doing is standing up a commission. We're not even coming out of that commission with remedies that can be implemented. They're coming out with crafted remedies that have to be converted into legislation, and we reset the clock and we start all over again, trying to get those remedies that may be converted into legislation passed into law. So the mere fact that we are still, after 3+ decades, trying to get a piece of legislation passed into law to stand up a commission is absolutely insane. It is totally insane. There's no other way that I can talk about it. So in conclusion, I say we must learn our collective histories. We must stand strong together. And when we stand strong together, we send a message that rings loud and clear that we stand in solidarity with each other. And when we stand in solidarity with each other, and someone is talking to you about reparations for those people over there, and it is a insult to the moral claims, I say, no, it's not an insult to the moral claims. The atrocities are an insult to the moral claims. And what has to happen is you have to give reparatory justice so that we can begin to define for ourselves what the redress will look like, what the remedies will look like, and what harms they will be able to erase, and what injuries they can make go away permanently. And until that happens, there can be no true equality and equitable treatment in this country. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I am so profoundly moved by your program today. And I just want to say, I really thank you for allowing me to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Kenniss, for your call to take a hard look at the moral stains of American history and stand with people of African descent to right the wrongs of centuries of historic injustice. As Kenniss reminded us, keeping our collective history alive is a critical part of this work. An essential part of the collective history of Japanese American organizing has been our commitment to solidarity. From Yuri Kochiyama's friendship with Malcolm X, to the rallying of Japanese Americans to support Muslim Americans in the aftermath of 9/11, to our present day campaign work to shut down family detention camps across the country, Japanese Americans have always stood by those communities that have been unjustly targeted for their race, religion, or country of origin. And the fight for reparations is no different. Last year, survivors and descendants of the camps made their voices heard and submitted testimony in support of HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. Here to read one of these statements is our very own Emily Akpan.
Hello. Thank you, Alexis, for the introduction, and also thank you again, Kenniss, for being here with us today. The fight for Black reparations will be with collective action and solidarity, and I'm honored that those of us within the Japanese American community will be pushing alongside you and other organizers for reparations that are long overdue. So now, as Alexis stated, I'll be reading a testimony submission in support of HR 40. This is submitted by Mika Kennedy, that points to our interconnected struggles and why Japanese Americans must support Black reparations. Okay. My name is Mika Kennedy. I'm writing to you in support of HR 40. Having moved to the state of Michigan in 2013, I've spent the last 8 years thinking about my life here as a Japanese American in a place that is not typically remembered for or identified by its Asian Americans. Like much of American history, the starkest and boldest color line in Michigan is Black versus white. The Great Migrations of the first half of the 20th century charted the movement of Black workers and families from the Jim Crow South to the rapidly industrializing North, places like Detroit. What they found there were labor opportunities, sometimes ample, sometimes scarce, depending on where and when and who you were, but also a continuing and pervasive racism, which the writer James Baldwin has described as being a not less deadly variety. Detroit may not have been of the Jim Crow South, but its color lines were written into law too. Racially restrictive covenants and redlining determined by virtue of the color of one's skin, where one might live. And even as these laws were scratched and still scratched from the books, their legacies remain. The history of Detroit and white flight to the suburbs, the evacuation of tax, money, and resources from now Black urban centers like Detroit and Flint, the urban blight that followed, are so salient in the histories of these places and of Michigan that is often is all we have known for outside of the Midwest. Detroit, murder capital. Flint, water crisis, 8 Mile. But the salience of this history and the white versus Black color line does not erase or exclude Japanese Americans living in Michigan today. By contrast, it defines our experience as well. HR 40 is part of what it means to be Japanese American living in Michigan and in the United States, because our histories are inexplicable, relational, and shared. And it was inextractable, rather. Here's why. During the Great Migration of the 20th century, Japanese Americans were migrating too. In this letter, I'll describe anyone of Japanese descent who has chosen to work and live in the United States as Japanese American, regardless of their place of birth or citizenship status. A few came to Detroit at the turn of the century, enchanted by the promise of the automotive industry. But the first major presence of Japanese Americans in Detroit was dictated by World War II and the incarceration of Japanese Americans in the U.S. interior West, from the Sierras of California to the swampland of Arkansas. Some of these incarcerated Japanese Americans were permitted to leave the camps before the end of the war, provided they resettled in the Midwest, rather than return to the military exclusion zone of the Pacific coast. But most followed later, as the war ended and the camps closed. In tandem with the Great Migration of Black people from the Jim Crow South, Japanese Americans came to Michigan to put the West Coast structurally anti-Asian society behind them. What Japanese Americans found was that they too were subjected to both the casual racism of street-side interactions to the deeper structures that built those streets and decided who might walk them. The experience of Japanese Americans and Black people in Michigan are not identical. The incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and the institutions of slavery, segregation, and their potent and visceral contemporary afterlives are not identical. They do not have to be, in order to be a meaningful historical relation to one another. Histories need not be identical to matter to each other, only kindred. Japanese Americans were caught in the wake of this white versus Black color line, and we continue to wobble from one side of the line to the other, depending on how our proximity to whiteness is evaluated at any given time by any given party. The fact that redress for Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II existed in our world, yet we are still debating whether to study the potential for a similar process with regard to slavery and all that followed and is following, speaks less to the fact that these histories are separate and more to the failings of continuing to imagine that they are alien to one another. In 1988, decades of community organizing came to partial fruition with the passage of the Civil Liberties Act, which acknowledged the federal wrong done to the Japanese American community during World War II and offered a form of reparation to the families of those affected. I'm sure you will receive many letters from my fellow Japanese Americans articulating the nuances of this bill. But what I want to focus on is the idea that its fruition was only partial. It is partial for many reasons. Among them, the oft-repeated knowledge that there is no complete reparations for intergenerational trauma. But it's also partial because the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II was never an isolated act, a single failure of political leadership, or something that can be tidily filed under wartime hysteria. Explanations offered in the very same act. The 1988 Civil Liberties Act allowed for the redress of a symptom rather than the disease itself. The experience of Japanese Americans during World War II is only one part of a system that continues to understand incarceration as central to order and races unequal under law, regardless of what the letter of the law might state. Regardless of the letter of the law, it is always move the streets, built or demolish the houses. It is in the water. So we must turn to history to understand these connections in the fullness of their meaning. That is what HR 40 proposes. What I know as Japanese Americans living in Michigan in the 21st century is that there's no way to tell the history of Japanese Americans without knowing the history of Black Americans. There's no way to live in this place, at least with any degree of responsibility to who we are and where we come from, without feeling that the ways this history continues to virtually shape our present. We call feelings without knowledge huntings, to gather knowledge to confront a haunting. This is justice, or at least the beginnings of it. And that's from Mika Kennedy, who submitted a testimony in support of HR 40. So the way that our community mobilized quickly to gather letters in support for Black reparations is something that I feel proud of. It shows that when our community fiercely shows up, it matters, that our collective action and solidarity for Black reparations matters. And it's far from over until we see Black people receive compensation for the generational violence of slavery. Later this year in the spring, please keep an eye out from us, NCRR, Nikkei Progressive, San Jose Nikkei Resistors, Studio for Solidarity, and more JA orgs who choose to partner with us as we continue to organize our community in support of HR 40 and Black reparations. And if you're interested in joining into this work, please reach out. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily, for that powerful testimony. And thank you to all of our speakers who eloquently wove together these two histories and the fight for reparations past and present. Now we'll be transitioning to our annual candle lighting ceremony, which will be led by Lauren Sumida and Saki Mori.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be able to lead this part of our program. And I wanted to just give folks a few minutes to gather any photos or candles or mementos that you want to bring, and we'll have a chance to hold them up. During this portion of the program, we will be transitioning to a regular Zoom meeting style so that we can all see each other in gallery view. So just for the next couple of minutes, I know we're running a bit over, please feel free to take a stretch break as well. Take care of yourself, maybe grab some water, and we'll come back at 2:20.
Recording in progress.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Maybe give it a couple more seconds. I hope you're able to grab something to drink and any photos, names, signs, or candles for this section. I'm just going to switch it to gallery view. Okay, I think we have most folks back. So just to introduce myself again, my name is Lauren Sumida. I am a New York Day of Remembrance committee member, and I'm honored to now introduce our candle lighting ceremony. And as we transition into this section, if you just for a moment, take a moment to settle into your seat, notice what's on your mind, who's on your mind, what you've been carrying and feeling today. And this part of the program is a space for everyone we would like to hold in our hearts today. Remember, I'd like to acknowledge that it's been a heavy time in New York City, in particular these past few weeks, for our communities with the violent deaths of Michelle Alyssa Go, Christina Yuna Lee, and Yao Pan Ma. So just to ground us and to start, we'll have a moment of silence for our community and who we've lost here. Thank you. We hope today gives space for some peace and reflection and feeling a bit more grounded to whatever extent you can in this moment amidst all of the violent systems that we're in. And in finding that balance, I wanted to offer a quote by a therapist, Ji-Yun Kim, a quote that's grounded me lately. So I'll paraphrase what she wrote in June 2020. She said, "Social justice work is grief work, and vice versa. We mobilize for social change in response to all of the ongoing losses we experience. And we make space to grieve every death and every loss along the way, to try to make the world a better place so that we can minimize the losses of the future." End quote. I think of our community's long legacy of holding both social justice and grief, and the path to healing that our community members have made through all of these chapters of our experiences. Holding Day of Remembrance gatherings, remembering and honoring our loved ones, what they lost and what we have lost, is part of how we make space for our grief, our love, and our care for one another. So I'll reiterate that I feel honored to be able to hold this space with you all through our candle lighting today. I'm now going to pass it over to Saki Mori for the reading of the camp names. Saki?
Thank you, everybody. It is a true honor to be here and to be part of this program today with you all, and thank you for joining us. I am going to read off the names of the camps, and so please go ahead and just take this moment to honor our community, our loved ones, and our future. And so if you have also photos of your family, a memento, a candle that you would like to read off, Please also feel free to display them on the screen as well with your video. So go ahead. Tule Lake.
My name is Tak Furumoto. I was born there, and through this candle, I'd like to honor my father Sam and my mother Yoshi Furumoto.
Jerome.
Sorry, like we can unmute if we have. It's okay. I want to honor my father and his family with dual diaspora. I was a child in both Jerome and in Rower, and it was loved New York, and so I'm so glad to be here and coming from Connecticut. Thank you.
Renata.
Hi, my family was both at Granada and Tule Lake. I hold my great grandmother's incense burner, and this is really nice. So, thank you.
Manzanar. Heart Mountain.
I have a photo of my grandfather's funeral in Heart Mountain.
Gila.
Hello. I would like to honor my father, Satoru Tsufura, and his brothers Tadashi and Hitoshi Tsufura, who were at Gila River, and their parents as well, and my uncle especially, who gave testimony. And this is a baseball from my father's days as a teenager, playing the game that he so loved and so many Japanese Americans so loved, behind the barbed wires.
I have a photo. These are my mother and father, late 40s, when they came out of Slocan, British Columbia. My family we're from Canada, but I lived in the United States for a long time, and in New York and New Jersey. So that's why I haven't given up my membership. These are their close group of friends. They were all teenagers when they moved from British Columbia to Toronto. It was a forced eastward move. So you have Japanese communities all across Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, Calgary, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, all over. So there was a forced move. They were not allowed to go back. And I found this presentation fabulous. It's eye-opening, looking at the Peruvian experience, because I have friends who were Brazilian and Peruvian here in Toronto. There's a lot of Peruvian and Brazilian Canadians of descent. So anyways, just wanted to thank everyone, thank the committee. It was wonderful, wonderful. It was my first time.
Topaz.
I want to remember Miyuki Takahashi, my mother. She was 5 when she went into camp, and most of her family was there with her, with my grandmother Tsuya. My grandfather was dead by that time, and she was a single mom with a bunch of kids in camp.
These are my grandparents, uncle and mom, my grandfather Hiroshi Takayama, grandmother Toyo, mother Keiko, and uncle Ken. The kids were born in Topaz, of course. Thank you for remembering them.
Minidoka.
I would like to honor my great grandmas who are in this picture, Grandma Nakamura and Grandma Fujikato, and my Grandma Toshi and Grandpa K's old home, and also my grandma who is right here, and she just turned 92 today. I mean, earlier this week, so that's really amazing.
I'd like to remember my mother, Murray Nishitani Sakamoto Nishi, and her entire family who were removed from Seattle and sent first to Camp Harmony in Puyallup and then on to Minidoka. And I'd also like to remember my uncle David, who, along with Frank Chin and Frank Abe and others in Seattle, organized the Day of Remembrance. Thank you.
This is my
Go ahead.
Block 36 at Minidoka. My grandmother, uncle, and father, who's also in one of the boxes down there in a red shirt. The Emas.
Rower.
This is my great aunt Gio and her husband. They have no children, so they are neighbors.
Oh.
You can say something. Austin.
Hi, remembering the Honda and Kodama families, both incarcerated at in Poston, Arizona.
In other internment camps.
This is
Hi.
This is a picture of my mother and brother.
Oh my.
Myself.
Nice.
Tell them what camp?
What camp?
Which one? Which camp?
Camp Minidoka.
Hi, I'd like to honor my great uncle, Uchiyama and family, who are here in New York City. They had some diplomatic ties to Japan, so they were arrested, sent to Greenbrier, West Virginia, to internment camp there, and returned to Japan on a hostage ship in 1942. And I don't have any pictures of them. I'm trying to find them.
Other than Jerome, those who are at other detention centers. And also if there's any friends that we would like to also honor tonight or today.
Sorry, I'm a little late. I'd like to honor my mother, who was in Heart Mountain. This is her when she was a girl of about 12 or 13, probably early on when she arrived at camp. And also her mother, Tomiko Matsumoto, who started writing tanka poetry in Heart Mountain, and a book of her and my grandfather's poems will be, the translations of their poems will be coming out this summer from UCLA Asian American Studies Press. So I'd like to honor the whole family. Thank you.
I'd like to honor Corky Lee,
who took this photo, probably in the 1980s, who always was in solidarity with the Japanese in his community.
I'm late also. I'd like to honor our parents, Flu Hitoshi Inaba and Misao Hamaoka Inaba, who were in, we call it Amachi, but I guess it's really Grenada internment camp. And also my mother's family, the Hamaokas, who are also in the same camp. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for holding space for all our loved ones, our communities, and those who we have lost, and for all of us to be able to come together to think about them and to honor them. And for all of those who didn't make it, who we don't know or hear about, lost to state violence, we carry you with us. And thank you to everyone who also shared in the chats as well. So this is a beautiful ceremony.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Suya, also for holding up our original camp signs, which are now also 40 years old, hand lettered and seen in some photos that were shared. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing such powerful stories and memories. To close us out from this program section, we will go back to we'll transition from this regular Zoom meeting style, but I just wanted to do a quick clearing to end. And I think now we will transition to our next section.
Powerful experience for me. Thank you for that. And I forgot to honor my own great-grandfather, Teichiro Maehara, who was incarcerated in a Department of Justice camp in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and also my grandfather, Saburo Maehara, who fought and died fighting for the 442nd. So this candle is for them. And thanks so much, Lauren, and to all the participants of the ceremony. As mentioned earlier in the program, our work for justice is an ongoing one, and we now look to some of the ways we can bring our legacy of resistance into the present moment and the ways in which we can all engage and continue the struggle. I'm so honored and pleased to introduce Mike Ishii, co-chair of NYDOR and staff organizer for Suru for Solidarity, to update us on the ongoing work of Suru for Solidarity around immigration rights and child and family detentions. And first, I believe we're going to begin with an excerpt from a newly released short documentary by Tani Ikeda and Vice, telling the story of Paul Tomita, a camp survivor, and his activist work against child detention with Suru for Solidarity.
Many psychiatrists and psychologists said everybody, including children who were in that camp situation, they will have at least diagnosis PTSD. At least that. America eventually, after 46 years, apologized in writing and in reparations.
My fellow Americans, we gather here today to
right a grave wrong. We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
In 2019, I received an email from my friend Nancy Ukai, and she said, hey, the U.S. government is going to build a 1,400 capacity detention center for unaccompanied minors, children. Would you be interested in protesting this? And so what we did, we planned on demonstrating in front of Fort Sill. Fort Sill was one of the camps that they put Japanese American leaders. It really angered me. And what I experienced myself is nothing compared to what they were potentially going to experience because they didn't have mom and dad there. To me, it was another example of white America doing despicable things to people of color. If you look in the past in history, American history, these mass incarcerations, these mass detentions or imprisonments, how come it happens to people of color only? The people look a little different, but it's the same shit that happened to me that they're trying to do today. See, and so it is up to me to say, stop it. We should have learned from what happened to me.
So I've been asked to give an update about the work to end detention, and this is not easy work for us, right? Because the ongoing state violence towards communities of color is a historic struggle, and we are struggling against it in this moment to today. So I'd like to give you an update about the work that is going on in the Japanese American community. I'm a staff organizer with Sudo for Solidarity. The NYDOR is a proud affiliate of Sudo, and Sudo was really started by organizers across the country, but I'm really proud as a member of NYDOR of the contribution of the core organizers from New York City who have really shaped the work of Sudo for Solidarity. In the past year, the escalation of violence has continued towards children, families, and immigrants in general who are being detained often in historic Japanese American incarceration sites across the country. We've also seen a very sharp escalation in deportations and in targeting particularly of Black immigrants. Even though the pandemic forced us to limit direct actions in person, this past year was filled with much rapid response in our national coalition work across the country. Sudo helped form the National Coalition Against Emergency Intake Sites to oppose mass incarceration of unaccompanied children being detained in the United States. We helped form the Family Liberation Abolitionist Network, also called FLAN, which is a united front of organizations opposing ongoing policies resulting in family detention, and family separation. This has gotten worse, not better, under this current administration. We led digital campaigns and fold-ins to pressure the current administration to end child detention and participated in meetings with Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security staff demanding closure of all of these sites. We also joined with national and local organizations, and we sent 40 volunteers, Japanese American camp survivors and their descendants, to El Paso, Texas this past July to protest at Fort Bliss, which is a former Japanese American incarceration site with flagrant human rights violations perpetuated against the over 2,400 children incarcerated there, as was outlined in 3 whistleblower reports that included accusations of child abuse, lack of hygiene, and rotten food and raw chicken being fed to children. We called for an end to child detention and facilitated healing circles with impacted communities recently released from a nearby adult detention center at the border. In the past year, though, we also did make some gains. So our work has actually paid off in some sense and created leverage. There are currently no families in the 3 officially designated family detention sites. However, the family detention sites have not been officially shut down or permanently closed. And this leaves open the door for possibility of the cruel family detention model to be resurrected at any moment. And for Karnes and Dillon, Texas, who have pivoted to imprisoning adult immigrants, and the Berks facility that has now pivoted to imprisoning female adult immigrants. These sites could pivot again back to family detention at a moment's notice. Our work around family detention will not be finished until we actually force the government to officially close down these sites and do away with them. We've seen a great reduction this past year in the number of unaccompanied children in detention sites as a result of the pressures that we've been mounting against them. These emergency intake sites are unregulated, so there are no human rights monitoring of these sites. Over 122,000 children unaccompanied were detained in these sites across the country in the past year. And now we have seen a great reduction in the recent past. However, there's still a lot of work to be done here. The US has the largest detention and carceral system in the world. In 2019, we imprisoned over 500,000 people who came to our borders. We put them in prisons. We are now, just this month, seeing a rapid re-escalation of the number of children who are in detention sites. At Fort Bliss in Texas, a month ago, there were 40 children. It had been reduced down to 40. 2 weeks ago, it had gone up in 1 week's time up to 700 children, and it's continuing to escalate now. Just last week, the US government released a document stating their intention to open multiple new influx sites for children. These are detention sites, and they want to open them in potentially 17 states across the country in the next period. And of course, many of you have already heard about the ongoing struggle to end Title 42, a policy that has created great suffering for people at the border. Also, the reinstatement of the migrant protection protocols, which are really forcing people to wait in Mexico where they're being preyed upon by drug lords and traffickers who are violating women and children sexually and kidnapping women and children and putting them into sexual slavery in some cases. So we need to end these systems and these policies at the border now. We know that until the US government ends a policy of criminalizing immigrants for exercising their human right to migrate, and until we end mass incarceration, that the work will not be done. We have seen an alarming recycling of Japanese American incarceration sites used and others considered this past year as sites to incarcerate immigrants. One thing we know for sure, a prison is a prison, whether you call it an internment site, a relocation center, an intake site, or a family residential center. The historic targeting of communities of color with forced removals, mass incarcerations, separation of families, and deportations must end once and for all. Close the camps. So there's some calls to action. And let me just quickly highlight a few of the things that SUDU is currently organizing and planning in this moment. And then I'll just tell you how you can get involved. So right now, SUDU is planning police prisons detention abolition training for the weekend of actually Saturday, March 5th and 12th at 1 p.m. And you can register for that by going to SUDU for Solidarity's website or checking our social media platforms. We are going to be publicizing the registration for that. We are also planning a letter writing virtual event in support of the California Vision Act and a direct pardon application for Lum Le, a Vietnamese man who is fighting ICE deportation. We will be hosting a book club event with author Kazu Haga from East Point Academy, who will speak about his book, Healing and Resistance. And with Kazu, we are planning a nonviolence direct action training this coming spring. We are currently in conversation internally and with our national partners about the need to escalate to oppose the massive plans to re-expand child influx detention across the country that we see as coming in the short months ahead. Stay tuned for more announcements about how we are going to escalate on that. As we speak now, SUDU for Solidarity, along with other organizations in Seattle, is staging a protest at the Northwest Detention Center as part of Day of Remembrance, and it will be broadcast live on the Instagram channel. Everyone is welcome to join in all of these actions and the committee work, and you can get connected to SUDU by going to suduforsolidarity.org and signing up to receive our newsletters. If you go on the website, and you'll see up in the top right-hand corner of the website, it just says sign up. And if you click on that, you can enter your email address, and then you'll get all of the announcements and newsletters from us. Finally, I'm going to transition now here. I've been asked on behalf of NYDOR to talk about how you can support the work of NYDOR. Much of that work that I just described for SUDU is being organized by members of the New York Day of Remembrance Committee. In addition, NYDOR runs our own programming here, and we have been very involved in abolitionist work and anti-detention work and remembrance work and solidarity work around reparations in the New York and tri-state area. As you saw with the beautiful presentation about the CWRIC hearings and that beautiful remembrance by Leslee Inaba, the work of this committee goes all the way back to when Concerned Japanese Americans, a committee that was ad hoc, met in New York to fight for reparations and redress, helmed by Yuri Kochiyama, her husband Bill, Michi Wegland, and many others. And so we carry on their tradition and their legacy today in solidarity with other communities that are fighting for civil liberties and to oppose state violence and end the legacies of white supremacy. We can't do this without you. We need you to be connected to us while we do this work in community. And we also need your donations to support the work so that we can send our people to Texas when there are demonstrations. We sent people to Oklahoma at Fort Sill when we closed down that proposal to bring 1,600 children. It was through the generous support of our members here that we could send a team of organizers to be on the ground and help stage that action. And our work continues and is expanding in this time. So on behalf of the committee, I want to say thank you for all of the support that you have offered us over the many years that we've been doing this work. And in the spirit of Yuri and Bill and Michi and Walter and so many others, and honoring also the members of the original committee that are here today. Some of them I saw in the Zoom. I saw Julia Zuma, I saw Teddy Yoshikami, of course, Leslie spoke, and there are many others who are present. Thank you for being here in community with us. And we look forward to working with you in the next year, and we welcome you for your support. We thank you for your support. And now I'll hand back to Lucas. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you. So one of the things I wanted to say was during our planning meeting early in the week, we were so blessed to have Leslie talk a little bit about it. At one point during the meeting, she said, "Hey, do you guys have any questions about that time period and what things that were going on?" And I was like, everybody was like, "Yeah, sure. We would love that opportunity." And one of the things she talked about was this powerful moment when Yuri Kochiyama sort of like passed out the sheets of the song to everybody and said, "Hey, let's end this meeting that's been somewhat contentious with a wonderful song." And so she wrote a song called "Redress, Reparations," and thanks to many folks who sort of like got together and sort of made little videos, and Conrad, who somehow figured out how to put this all together. I don't know how he did it. We are going to get a chance to hear that song. It was important. It was important for for bringing community together back in the early 80s, and we want to see if we can bring that spirit back today. All right, so without further ado, the Redress Reparations song by Yuri Kochiyama. Oh, one other thing. After the video, I just wanted to let you know, we'll be going back to regular Zoom afterwards.
Restitution from our nation. Justice calls out for compensation for 100,000 wronged. The deserts, lost and mountains, we will send to our land. To concentration camps for restoration of land. We live in Syria, and victory for Japanese ancestry. Yes, it's time for redress, reparations, restitution from our nation. Justice calls out for compensation for 120,000 wronged. Yes, our brothers, fathers are willing to volunteer and give their lives a sacrifice for countries to secure. A regiment that harmony really loves history. Japanese ancestry. Many those left behind in camp disgrace, and lost the treasure, times not safe. Japanese ancestry. It's time for redress, reparations, restitution from our nation. to share